In 1994, when BMW bought Rover, the British company was certainly facing some problems, but it was still operating steadily, still building cars, and at least in the British Isles, it still had stable demand. Just 6 years later, in 2000, when BMW decided to sell Rover, the situation was completely different. The company was building cars that almost nobody wanted. It was losing money, and it was effectively standing with one foot in the grave. And the main irony of this story is that the Rover 75, a car many people consider the best model in the brand's history, turned into a complete failure instead of a serious success and a breakthrough. Today, we will look at the rather sad story of Rover, what role BMW played in its death, and how the 75 managed to outlive the company itself. The Rover brand appeared back in the late 19th century, and at first it produced bicycles. The first Rover car was built in 1904, in the early days of the global automobile industry. After surviving 2 world wars, many rises and falls, and several major crises, Rover became known by the middle of the 20th century as a maker of middle-class cars. And in 1977, the large Rover SD1 with a V8 engine even won the title of European Car of the Year. By that time, however, the brand's reputation had already been badly damaged by quality problems and instability inside the company itself. By the late 1980s, the strongest forces in the British passenger car market were the American Ford, Vauxhall, which also belonged to the American General Motors, and the German Volkswagen. Ford and Vauxhall focused on high sales volumes and produced many affordable cars with less than perfect build quality and reliability. Volkswagen chose a different path, higher quality, but also a higher price. The new head of Rover Group, Graham Day, who had been appointed under Margaret Thatcher's government, was supposed to lead the company out of its long crisis, and he decided to follow Volkswagen's example, to focus not on cheapness, but on quality, and quality was exactly what almost the entire Rover Group lineup badly lacked at the time. The leading role in this strategy was given to the Rover brand. The Austin brand was dropped in 1987 because of its badly damaged image and weak prospects. By that point, everything sold under the Austin name was seen, even in the home market, not to mention export markets, as outdated and uncompetitive junk. As part of the updated strategy, the British strengthened their cooperation with Japan's Honda even further. This partnership had begun back in the British Leyland era. By the time Rover Group was sold to British Aerospace, this cooperation had already produced the Rover 800, the brand's new flagship, built on a shared basis with the Honda legend. In the following years, the same approach was supposed to produce the more mass-market Rover 200 and Rover 400. Thanks to Japanese technology, platforms, and engineering culture, Rover managed to noticeably improve the quality of its products. It seemed that the plan was starting to work. The company no longer looked like a hopeless fragment of British Leyland. It had a new flagship, technical support from Honda, and a proper model range ahead of it. The British government, however, saw the situation differently and was still looking for a way to get rid of Rover Group, which, let me remind you, was still state-owned. The government remembered very well that Rover was part of the British Leyland legacy, a huge, troubled, and politically toxic monster. In the 1970s, the state had already spent enormous sums on British Leyland and constantly had to put out one crisis after another: strikes, losses, conflicts with trade unions, and quality scandals. Even if Rover looked noticeably better by the end of the 1980s, for the government, it still remained part of British Leyland's toxic legacy. Besides, this was the Thatcher era, and the logic was simple. The state should not own car factories. Its task was to privatize, reduce government involvement, and remove from state ownership companies that could demand new financial injections at any moment. And then, a politically convenient buyer appeared. British Aerospace was ready to buy Rover Group, and the British government could present the deal not as a sale to a foreign owner, but as a transfer of the company to a large and successful British business. In 1988, the deal was completed, and British Aerospace became the owner of Rover Group for £150 million. The new owners began reorganizing Rover Group with real enthusiasm. It was under British Aerospace that the Land Rover Discovery appeared, and a little later, the classic utilitarian Land Rover received the Defender name. The Range Rover gradually began turning into the luxury SUV that would later take a special place in the market for expensive off-road vehicles. Things were also going fairly well for Rover itself. For example, the second-generation Rover 200 sold quite confidently, which by the company's standards was a very good result. All of this made it possible to believe that Rover had really recovered from its old problems, and that it now had a future not only in Britain, but also beyond it. But Rover had one very weak point: its dependence on Honda. It was Japanese technology that had helped the British sharply improve quality, update the model range, and restore customer confidence. But Honda had its own plans in Europe, and the Japanese were not going to help a company forever when that company was increasingly turning into their competitor. So Honda began limiting the further use of its technology and increasing the cost of cooperation. The management of British Aerospace understood this very well. They also understood that in the future, this dependence could become a serious problem. So the company had two options: urgently find a new partner or sell Rover Group while it was still a viable asset. As you can imagine, they chose the second option. The new owner of Rover Group was BMW. The deal was valued at around £800 million. At first glance, the German purchase of Rover did not look entirely obvious. By that time, Rover was perceived in Britain as noticeably more upmarket than Ford and Vauxhall, and some of its models could even compete with the BMW 3 Series. So many British people reacted to the sale of Rover to the Germans with skepticism. They feared that BMW would not seriously develop a brand that, in some segments, could become a direct competitor. But BMW itself had different reasons for buying Rover. In the early 1990s, the global auto industry was rapidly consolidating. Large car groups were becoming even larger, while BMW was still a relatively small premium manufacturer. In Munich, there was concern that in the future, the niche of expensive sedans and coupes alone would not be enough. Rover Group had something BMW itself did not have: mass-market front-wheel drive cars and Land Rover. And Land Rover already made up a significant part of Rover Group's business, with sales continuing to grow. During the first few years, BMW took almost no serious action regarding Rover. The cars were produced more by inertia and still relied heavily on Honda technology. Only in 1997 did the Germans decide to take their British assets seriously, by which point the model range had long needed renewal. That same year, around £600 million were invested, but not in Rover itself. The money went into Mini. BMW needed a compact premium front-wheel drive car, but the Germans were hesitant to release such a car under their own brand because it could damage BMW's image. Mini suited this role perfectly. The production Mini entered the market in 2001 and became a real hit in Britain and Europe. Land Rover and Range Rover were also doing fairly well. But for Rover itself, the situation was getting worse. Sales were falling quickly, and the model range still was not receiving its long-awaited renewal. It was against this background that the Rover 75 was presented in 1998. It went on sale in 1999 and was supposed to replace both the Rover 600 and the Rover 800. In effect, it was the only completely new Rover created under BMW, so the expectations around it were extremely high. When the Rover 75 was officially presented to the public, the reaction to its design was very positive, both from the press and from potential buyers. Many people assumed that this retro style had appeared thanks to the Germans, but that was not true. The Rover 75 did debut under BMW, but its roots went back to Rover's own development work, and its exterior was created by the British designer Richard Woolley. Of course, there was some control from the German side, but the British still had enough freedom to create a car that felt truly English in spirit, and they succeeded. From the first glance at the Rover 75, it was clear where it came from. First, there were the four round headlights, which reminded people of Jaguar and Bentley. Second, there was the smooth, almost candy-like body, which, together with clean proportions, created a classic image. Third, the car had a very distinctive face thanks to the line of the hood. It seemed to flow over the headlights while also framing the oval radiator grille. The vertical rear lights also looked elegant and very English. There was just the right amount of chrome. At the front, along the sides, at the rear, and even around the window openings. Inside, the same British theme continued. Thanks to the abundance of walnut veneer and the striking color palette, the interior looked almost luxurious. And the final shot straight into the heart of a potential buyer was the instrument cluster, with classic ivory-colored dials and a matching clock in the center of the dashboard. If this was not quite the spirit of ecstasy, it was already something very close. At the same time, this car, clearly inspired by the past, looked fresh and modern. It did not feel like a cheap parody of Old England. And who could have imagined that this very design, which pleased the automotive press so much, would eventually become one of the reasons for the model's failure? Behind the enthusiastic articles and equally enthusiastic reactions from potential buyers, there was a more sober reality. Fans of retro styling are a fairly narrow audience. These are people who feel nostalgic for the past, when everything was supposedly better, more solid, and more real, including cars. But this audience did not define the mass market. Many buyers wanted the opposite: novelty, modernity, and a sense of moving forward. In their eyes, Rover looked like a brand trapped in its own past and no longer capable of looking into the future.
The Rover 75 seems to confirm something that I've long feared, that Britain is being turned into a fatuous theme park, obsessed with heritage and cowering behind a barricade of stupid nostalgic knickknacks. This is Rover. Rover, the company that gave us great cars like the P6, the SD1 and that experimental turbine car. I want something modern, not a great day out in history. This ridiculous hankering for the past is just not British. I can't stand it!
On top of all this, during the model's presentation at the Birmingham Motor Show in October 1998, BMW chief Bernd Pischetstreiter gave a speech that was almost unbelievable in its substance. He publicly spoke about Rover's problems, possible help from the British government, and the future of the Longbridge plant. And all of this was said right during the presentation of the Rover 75, a model for which such revelations were a blow below the belt. A buyer does not want to buy an expensive sedan from a brand that already smells of a funeral, especially when the owner of that brand is publicly talking about its problems. The Rover 75 was supposed to sell in much larger numbers. Plans mentioned figures of up to 150,000 cars a year. But in 1999, only about 53,000 Rover 75s were built. In the following years, this figure did not grow. It gradually declined. The more compact Rover 25 and Rover 45, which appeared shortly after the flagship, received a similar brand style. But in essence, they remained updated versions of older models. They could not radically change the company's situation either. Instead of bringing profit, Rover continued to bring BMW huge losses. According to BMW, Rover's losses grew from £642 million in 1998 to around £750 million in 1999. And this was despite the fact that the Germans had already invested billions into their British asset, while saving it would require even more enormous investment. So inside BMW, it became increasingly clear that Rover had to be sold. Interestingly, by that point, the new Mini had not even entered the market yet. By keeping Mini for itself, BMW was effectively taking a second risk with retro design. And who knows what BMW's reputation would look like today if the company had failed twice in a row, first with the Rover 75 and then with the new Mini. But Mini did not fail. On the contrary, it became one of BMW's most successful decisions. In 2000, Rover Group was effectively broken up. Land Rover was sold to Ford for £1.85 billion. BMW kept Mini. And what remained of Rover cars and MG was sold to the Phoenix Consortium for a symbolic £10 sterling. For many fans of the brand, this was a humiliating moment. But the fact remains. The new owners, who had received Rover almost for free, moved MG Rover Group production to the Longbridge plant in Birmingham. In 2004, already without Richard Woolley, they tried to modernize the Rover 75. They softened the four-headlight look, changed the front end, and fitted a larger radiator grille, visually lowered toward the lower part of the bumper. At the same time, a two-door coupe concept was shown, although nobody seriously intended to put it into production. At the same time, the trim of the cars was gradually simplified in an attempt to reduce costs. Phoenix wanted to revive interest in the car not only with the facelift, but also with a new rear-wheel drive V8 version powered by a Ford engine. But none of this helped. The Rover 75 never became the rescue the company needed, and Rover itself once again became a troubled asset. In 2005, the Birmingham plant stopped, and production of the last Rover came to an end. But the Phoenix Consortium story had an even more unpleasant side. The company bought Rover for a symbolic £10, and along with it received a large financial package from BMW, described in publications as a loan or a financial dowry. The amount was roughly 427 to 500 million pounds. At the same time, the four leaders of the Phoenix Consortium, known as the Phoenix Four, paid themselves large bonuses and rewards, while MG Rover was losing money. For many people, this looked like openly draining money out of a dying company. In April 2005, MG Rover collapsed into bankruptcy, and the investigation into this story took the British government several years and cost millions of pounds. The story of the Rover 75 did not end there. Even before the collapse of MG Rover, in 2004, China's SAIC acquired the rights to the technology of the Rover 25 and Rover 75, but it did not receive the rights to the Rover name itself. So instead of Rover, a new brand appeared, Roewe, and the Chinese successor to the Rover 75 became the Roewe 750. After MG Rover went bankrupt in 2005, the company's main assets, including the MG brand, the Longbridge plant, and some of the production equipment, were bought by another Chinese company, Nanjing Automobile. It was Nanjing that released its own version of the car based on the Rover 75, called the MG7. In the end, the situation became almost absurd. The legacy of one British car was divided between two Chinese companies. One produced the Roewe 750, the other produced the MG7. In 2007, Nanjing became part of SAIC, and the Chinese chapter of the Rover 75 story gradually faded away. The Roewe 750 lasted longer than the original Rover 75, but eventually it also left the market. So the Rover 75 really became not only the last large Rover, but also a car that outlived its own brand. But let's return to BMW and the main question. Were the Bavarians responsible for Rover's collapse? The answer is complicated and not entirely clear. But one thing can be said with confidence. The Germans could have saved the Rover 75 and possibly even turned it into a success. In essence, it was a good car, comfortable, well-equipped, well-built, and reasonably reliable. BMW needed to support the model, give it a timely facelift, and gradually move it away from excessive retro styling toward a more modern look. This is roughly what Ford later did with Jaguar after the failure of its neo-retro experiments. But BMW, as a financially stable company, chose to get rid of Rover. Maybe this was influenced by shareholders demanding profit. Maybe Munich simply did not believe in the future of the brand. Maybe Rover had become too inconvenient and too expensive an asset for them. We will probably never know the exact answer.